Good afternoon, and welcome to Strategies to Secure Your Move to the Cloud, a health system CIO Media Inc. production, sponsored by ClearDATA. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. My name is Anthony Guerra. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Health Systems CIO, and I will be your moderator today. We're looking forward to your participation. You can send in your questions or comments at any time in the Q&A box, and we'll take them later in the program. Just so you see how we're going to spend our time, first we're going to go about 40 minutes with our main panel discussion featuring Michael Carr, VP and CIO at Health First, Sanjeev Shah, VP and CISO at Centura Health, and Andy Gilbert, Chief Revenue Officer with ClearDATA. And then we will have our Q&A. So let's jump right in. Michael, let's start with you. Can you give us an overview of your organization and your role?
Sure, and thanks for having us today and sponsoring this conversation. So Health First, we're an integrated delivery network, the only one in Central Florida. We're on the Space Coast, so think SpaceX, Cape Canaveral, that's our geography. We're about 9,000 associates, we said about third health plan, third hospital, third delivery system. Been around for about 30 years, and this is a topic near and dear to us because we're going through a lot of this transformation and modernization, and cloud seems to be a big piece of that. So my role as CIO, I've been in this role for about 2 months now, so fairly new to the role, been in the organization about 3.5 years. My background is as both CTO and CISO, so been on the security side of it, and now as a CIO, it's both the cloud and the securing the cloud are two things we spend a lot of time thinking about. So.
Very good, Michael. Thank you. Sanjeev?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Hello, everyone. My name is Sanjeev Shah. I serve as Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer for Centura Health. My organization is a healthcare system extending whole person care to communities and people we serve in Colorado, Kansas, and Utah. In my role, I lead infrastructure and engineering, as well as information security functions for my organization. Working with my teams, stakeholders, partners, we strive to create a secure, resilient, and efficient technology ecosystem to support business and clinical operations, as well as enable corporate strategy. Again, thank you for having me.
All right, very good. Andy?
Great. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for everyone's participation and joining us today. We really appreciate it. I am Andy Gilbert, the Chief Revenue Officer of ClearDATA, and what ClearDATA is we are a healthcare-only company that we provide a platform that allows you to operate in healthcare companies to operate in the cloud in a compliant and secure manner. We protect the PHI. It enables you to run in a high trust certified environment because we have think of the CSPM software, then all the services from security, compliance, operations that help people reduce their cost, reduce their risk, while accelerating time to value and making sure you're on a secure, safe platform in the cloud. We have about 250 clients. So hoping to bring a little bit of that rounded what we see from our entire client base to this conversation today. So thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Andy. All right, big slide here, lots of stuff. So we're going to take our time as we go through it. Michael, we're going to start with you. Discuss the complexities of cloud security and compliance, especially with PHI. How and why is it different than providing security to in-house data centers? What's involved with retraining existing staff to deal with cloud security and compliance? And when is it necessary to bring in new staff with different skill sets? So a lot there, wherever you want to start.
Yeah, I like how you started with the easy question first. Yeah, I would say, I think the first thing is, when you think about securing in the cloud is understanding what it is that you're securing. What I mean by that is a lot of vendors, almost all the vendors offer a cloud solution nowadays. And when you dig in, the question, is it really a cloud solution, or are you just hosting this in someone else's data center? And is it cloud in terms of how I think of cloud, in terms of how it scales, how you access it, the billing piece of that. So is it IaaS, is it PaaS, is it SaaS? So I think the first piece is understanding that. And then the second one is understanding the capabilities of the security vendor. I think a lot of times, transparently, they oversell how secure their platforms are. And we've seen that with a number of data breaches. Just moving it to the cloud doesn't inherently make it any more or less secure. And so I think one is understanding what it is, what type of service it is, how having the team understand how it operates differently than on-prem. And then, of course, if you're managing it in your cloud instance, or if it's just a service that you're subscribing to, I think that's a lot of the upfront work that if you're primarily living in an on-prem environment and moving to the cloud, that takes some time for your engineers and technologists to understand.
Michael, quick follow-up there. I mean, is the biggest distinction here if you're managing it versus someone else is managing it? Because if someone else is managing it, that kind of takes it off your plate. If you're managing it, I think that's where we get into most of the issues of, do you know what you're doing?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great way to clarify that. And even you know, that's the big distinction. Even if they are managing it, you know, there's sometimes a penchant for people to say, well, the vendor owns that, the vendor owns that. No, we're still accountable, regardless if the vendor is managing. We still have to assess them. We still have to audit them, right? So it changes the scope and role of more of an audit compliance role versus I'm actively securing that. So we still have an accountability. We can't just say hands off because the vendor's handling the security.
Right. And so you don't get away from the fact that you need to understand how it needs to be secured in the cloud by giving it to someone else. Because if you don't understand it, you can't audit them. You can't judge whether or not they're doing the proper thing. So you really don't get away from having to understand the complexities of securing things in the cloud.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Very interesting. All right, Sanjeev, your thoughts.
You know, Michael, I think that was very well articulated in terms of, you know, how that is a joint accountability and responsibility in terms of protecting cloud assets and cloud systems. You know, so protecting cloud resources and workloads and apps in an ecosystem can come in various different flavors depending on the service that we are talking about, right? So it's not always just either infrastructure as service or platform as service or software as service. We could have one of each of those scenarios at play, and our responsibilities can vary depending on which particular flavor of cloud or cloud offering we're discussing and we're talking about. So, you know, things get complex pretty quick when we talk about cloud security. You know, these solutions really play a critical role in enabling our digital transformation for our organizations because of the nature of solutions that are available and how quickly we can adapt and excel and expedite our digital transformations. But to leverage it, we must have an heightened trust and confidence in the efficiency of the service, the security of it, and resilience of it. So security is complex. It's a very complex topic. Whether we are transitioning to the cloud or further along the journey to achieve security and compliance requirements across all of these types of offerings for either apps, resources, or services, a thoughtful and programmatic approach is really needed. And that thoughtful and programmatic approach goes from initially even arranging the service and what type of contractual arrangements you have to what type of safeguards and controls and monitoring you have in place. What's the ongoing monitoring capabilities? What are the roles and responsibility among the stakeholder group that's working to safeguard that solution, right? So sometimes it's internal associates, at times it's your partners, and at times it's service providers. In all of that, what I'm probably conveying for our audience is that it's a complex topic and requires thoughtful and deliberate process by which each of these issues ought to be addressed.
Sanjeev, when you're talking, it made me think about how important I'm guessing it is for the business to stay in step with IT, represented by the CIO, to stay in step with the CISO. You talk about these different types of arrangements and the complexities of them, and I'm picturing scenarios where things are changing as the business is having conversations with the vendor. You know, scenarios are thrown out. Let's move forward in this way. Let's move forward in that way. perhaps the CISO and IT are brought in and feedback is given. And then at some point, that scenario on the business side with the vendor changes. Oh, well, no, let's do it that way. But the CISO and the CIO are not brought along to the new flavor. And then all of a sudden you say, whoa, that's not what, that's not the last thing I heard about. That's much different. Does that make sense that all these entities need to keep security, especially and IT, in the loop as these discussions go forward? It can't change without you guys being involved.
No, absolutely. There's a right time for security mindset to be partnering with business as well as IT processes to provide input or advice or architectural decisions and standards that help shape that overall decision making. So, for example, let's say we're having conversation with a business partner, and IT is represented by IT business partner in that relationship. We are brought into the conversation to ensure that we have a good understanding of the topic being discussed. At some point, it becomes a formal request, a formal idea that then goes through architectural considerations and discussion in terms of how does it fit into our current architecture, what else needs to evolve to support the model, what are the security considerations that we need to make. And then, I want to also focus on stability and resilience aspect of it beyond security. And as I lead infrastructure and engineering, I'm extremely mindful of its supports and operations in the long view as well. So as long as information security in all its form has an ability to participate and provide that input, which we do in our organization, then we're able to guide our business partners and our IT colleagues in a way that outcomes are much more positive majority of the time. And we can all acknowledge that in our realities, in our environments, things sometimes move faster, but there are different checkpoints in the process to give us an opportunity to provide the right input. And I think that's the only way to really be a productive participant in the process in enabling as well as supporting the business needs.
Michael, any thoughts there about potential decoupling of, as things evolve where IT is brought in, but not perhaps updated as scenarios change? And then so you could have a decoupling between business and IT. You could also have a decoupling between IT and security.
Yeah, I think that relationship, regardless of reporting relationship, has to be in tune. I think what I've seen has been successful is, and it kind of goes back to the first question, is we have to be more involved with the vendor roadmap than we were able to in the past. I think the earlier you get involved and understand where they're going, because what I found with a lot of healthcare vendors, yeah, the big ones are pretty mature, but a lot of the vendors we deal with are not large, mature, I would say enterprise class software vendors. So those are the ones I'm most concerned about is how do we help them and consult with them, understand what the business is trying to do with them. And a lot of them are very receptive to taking customer feedback, say, we want to do this, right? So we're trying to embed our engineers and our technologists, our security team with them, so we can help influence the roadmap to make sure that as they're building out new functions and capability, that they're not forgetting the security aspect, and we're trying to secure it on the back end.
All right, Andy, lots of stuff going on there. Where do you want to jump in? What's the number one thing on your mind after listening to all that?
It's really interesting that both Sanjeev and Michael, approach it from a couple different directions, the same question. And, you look at, we have, like I mentioned, we have 240, 50 clients, and we have three different segments of clients, basically: the health tech vendors that Michael was talking a lot about, right? The payers and providers, and then life sciences. So on the health tech side, a lot of what these companies come to us for, and a lot of our clients, what they tell us is, they're a smaller company. They're providing machine learning algorithms. They're providing supply chain solutions. They're providing revenue operations platforms, things like that. And they want to keep their people focused on developing those applications of the platforms. They don't want to worry about the security and the compliance and things like that. So what they do is, their main objective is to come to us and to run within our platform within either Azure, AWS, or GCP. And once they're on our platform, they can then use our high trust attestation. They can use our SOC 2 to go to Michael or Sanjeev and say, hey, here, look, we have all of this because we know we're running with this compliance. Here's our compliance scores over time. They're able to prove back in history, show you that they're doing those types of things. So that really serves a very interesting piece of our business. But then Sanjeev, to a lot of the things that you were talking about from the application development side, what we tend to run in, and our clients come to us and they say, I think you said you have to be very thoughtful about your approach to the cloud, because there is so much, and it's not just one cloud. Many of our clients are multi-cloud, right? So what happens is, for example, we had a client who came to us and said, hey, we've got this Azure thing figured out. We've got a person, we've got, people who understand Azure, we're good there. But then all of a sudden, our innovation team comes to us and says they won't use Azure, they want to use AWS. And, for whatever reason, this group was more comfortable with that. So they didn't want to slow the business down. So we were helping them, and we've deployed our solution across their AWS environment. And they're actually running an Epic read-only instance over there, as well as some innovation projects. And they're doing that because they said, hey, what we really want to do is we're going to focus on this Azure stuff. You guys, it's almost a stamp of approval from a framework perspective, because as you mentioned, things change on a daily, monthly basis, where these controls change, where the compliance changes, where the security changes. So we have all that back end, the security tooling. We use third-party tooling, things like the best of breed stuff. We have our own compliance platform. But then once and you have that familiarity and you have that trust that if it's deployed within that ClearDATA platform, all of a sudden you trust that they can go ahead and move, and they're able to stay agile while maintaining the compliance that you would expect in order to deliver in a secure and compliant manner. So it's a really, our clients come to us because, and they tell us that, this multi-cloud thing, as well as then, over time, we've had a bunch of our clients who just over time, they said, you know what, I no longer want to keep up with this. There's 500 different controls within high trust that I have to keep up with, and I have to know, and I can no longer keep up with all of these on a daily, monthly basis. And this is all you do. Okay, you take care of this for us. And so those are the types of things, those are the reasons people are coming to us, because it is complex, and they want to focus their time. And many times it's the application developers who are kind of saddled with this part-time, or somebody else that says, oh yeah, you also have to know these cloud security or cloud compliance controls. And, they don't want to deal with that. They want to do their application development job. They want to bring the data over. They want to do all these other things that, and focus on their day job. And so that's what we're seeing a lot of, is these clients who want to move fast, they want to be agile, and they're just struggling with keeping up with the pace of change.
So Andy, high trust is interesting, right? I've heard some CISOs say, absolutely they want to see it. I've heard another one specifically remember saying, I've got my own qualifications, so I don't care what you have, you're going through my system, because
Yep.
I'm even more extensive than high trust. So were different points of view I've heard from very reputable CISOs on
Yeah.
high trust. But I'm assuming that people like Sanjeev and Michael want to see something, right? Something is probably better than nothing. So what's interesting, what you're saying is, and high trust I've heard is quite onerous to get, but now they have tiers, which makes it a little easier for some of the smaller vendors. But you're saying they can come in under you and sort of get your coverage in a sense, for like they get the high trust stamp by coming in under you. Is that right?
Yeah. And just to be clear, we can evaluate, you can kind of, from just a pick down menu, it's really easy for us to switch to NIST or ISO, or HIPAA or high trust. So I just use high trust as an example, but because high trust is, especially the 9.5 2 that we're on is an onerous process. And everyone who goes through that, people feel some level of comfort that says, okay, I understand that there's, that comfort. And so when like a health tech vendor leverages us, they can't go out and say that they're high trust certified because they leverage us, but they can say that we're running in a high trust certified environment. And here's the attestation to prove that. And so, that it is a step towards that. And they can inherit, if they want to get high trust certification on their own, they can inherit over half the controls from us.
So it gets them somewhat towards that goal.
Right. And so whether it's a healthcare provider, payer, or a health tech company, you can inherit our controls and things like that. So it makes it easier for those people who do want to take on that journey of high trust.
Sanjeev, let me ask you about that. What are your thoughts there? What do you like to see? Again, I've heard those different perspectives, and it's not just high trust, as Andy mentioned. There's different things out there, but vendors coming to you, what are you looking for?
Yeah, Anthony, that's a really good question, and I'd love to comment on that as well. Andy, when I heard you speak about, how certain validations help with customer trust and confidence, right? High trust is a perfectly good framework to leverage for seeking that validation, seeking that certification, as well as others like SAT-70 Type 2 and so on. But I think the important aspect of that is validating the fact that all of the components of information security measures that we would be interested in, which is incorporated in NIST, incorporated in high trust, that the organization and its people, its processes and systems are meeting the requirements within it. Meeting the requirements within it to a degree gives us the confidence that all aspects that are very important from a security and privacy as well as compliance perspective, organization is capable of handling. So if you think about it from a customer perspective, it gives us the confidence to make that move, because we internally, when we build systems and deploy system, our people follow processes, we essentially employ the same measures for ourselves, right? We're not just putting a burden on someone else that we wouldn't put on ourselves, because at the end of the day, we're looking for comprehensive security with compliance that addresses the issue of resilience as well. And so if we're doing that, applying that in one place, but not applying that somewhere else, it doesn't give you the advantage you're looking for from a business operations perspective. So to Andy's point, that's the part that I was focusing on, is just ensuring that, again, you have a thoughtful methodological process to leverage to give you the confidence and trust that you seek in adopting any type of technology, including cloud services.
Michael, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm with Sanjeev too on that. I'm a big standards guy, so you kind of go to the basics, and that's a way to weed out people who haven't put in the time or thought about it up front, whether it's NIST or high trust or others. It's kind of a starting point for us, and so I think the other piece is kind of the auditing, and that's fine. Show us, prove us, right? And that's where I think a lot of times it falls down for some of the vendors. Is like, great, you've done this initial certification. Show me that you have these controls. Show me what you're, And so I think that's where a lot of them struggle, because they probably brought in, I'm guessing they brought in somebody to help them build out the initial, security of their platform or their application, but they're not big enough to have a dedicated security team or people looking at it. So that's sometimes what we find is the rub of when we say prove to us the audit side of it. They struggle to be able to kind of meet our expectations, and sometimes that rules out vendors for us.
And Michael, I think if it's okay, what I wanted to also highlight along those lines is that cyber hygiene is so important in making sure, one, you have safeguards and controls present, but they're also effective, right? And try to validate that across all areas of cybersecurity on your own. It takes resources and time to be able to do that. And so these validations and certifications are a way to get to that answer for a third party, for sure, in a meaningful and comprehensive and most efficient way.
Sanjeev, you use the term present, but also effective. Tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that. How can
Well,
it be present and not effective, right? That's the
well,
question.
yeah, so a very simple example would be, let's say you have endpoints like computers and laptops, and you have a malware defense tool running on it. But the malware defense tool can run in monitor mode, protect mode, and there are other variations of that. If it's just in a monitor mode, for example, yes, safeguard is present, it's monitoring, but it's really not preventing it from expanding or going from somewhere from there. So just using a very simple example, you have it, but it's not effective use of it in its full intent, right? It's effective, the fact that it's monitoring is present, but not necessarily it's safeguarding. Now, since I made that comment, I should also say not in all places you can go ahead and apply all elements of a safeguard, but sometimes we know that work to make things easier and not become a much more difficult work, or some organizations don't have resources to make it happen. You go to take the first step, but you never really complete the full step. And so that's where the effectiveness comes from. And that's just a simple example. And there are hundreds of examples like that.
Yes, Sanjeev, I agree with you. The thing that we often see is when vendors will come and say, hey, we've got a highly resilient architecture. We're in 2 data centers, geographically diverse, a full DR environment. And we say, great, show us the last time you tested it. And they're like, well, we haven't tested it. And you have it, but if you can't prove that it works, if you can't tell me like, hey, yeah, here's our RTO and RPO and how we tested internally, you have it, but it's not effective. You can't prove that it actually works. And I'm always surprised at how many times people say, yeah, we haven't done that yet.
Michael, it's very similar to having a incident response plan, but never really having the opportunity to have a tabletop exercise. So when things happen, we scramble because most people or organizations haven't had the opportunity to actually exercise that. And so, just maybe a advice for the community would be, if you have one, please exercise it. If you don't have one, please put one together and conduct an exercise. It will be a huge advantage when it's needed.
Absolutely.
So, Sanjeev, is the point sort of that even if there is certification, extra review is required to make sure it's effective use? Or is it that when you have certification that shows effective use, that's been verified?
Well, I think certification leads to a periodic assessment, right? So it's in a particular time period that assessment was conducted, and thus you have a certification for that period. The conversation we're having in terms of effectiveness has to do with ongoing presence of safeguards and controls and how effective are they. But also with certifications, environments change, architectures change, people, processes, and technologies, components change. So having ongoing monitoring of that, with business partners or within your organization is also an important aspect of remaining resilient. And resilient means, that you have effective safeguards and controls, and you continue to strive to make them even more effective. And then if things do occur from a cyber perspective, that you have a way to recover quickly and efficiently, and bringing organizations back to operations, right? That's part of being resilient. And we know that very well from a variety of our life experiences. And the same is true for even technology and technology ecosystems.
Great points. Andy, let's bring you in here. And if you want to expand on this concept that nobody who's doing their job properly in a security position is satisfied with a moment in time snapshot of anything, right? Because we talk about how things change. Companies may have everything straightened out at that moment of certification, and then things change. People leave who are doing things well. People come in who aren't doing things as well. There's an acquisition. They acquire a company, take their eye off the ball, or they are acquired and are no longer the ones in charge. of what's going to happen. So things continually change. And when you have hundreds of vendors and constantly new vendors being requested and coming on, you also have hundreds of, these hundreds of existing vendors, which perhaps you would like to review according to a new standard that you've put in place. So, now we're going to do this for all incoming vendors. Or what about the 500 we have? Well, some people are saying, and I've heard this, some people say, well, I'm not going back. I'm not going to worry about that. I'm going to worry about going. I've literally heard it. It's just too much. So we're just going to not worry about that. I'm going to manage the new ones to the new bar. Other companies are going back and saying, I want to bring everybody up to this bar. Huge, huge projects. And again, can't have snapshots in time. So this all has to be done at certain periodic intervals. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's really interesting. A lot of our provider clients go through that. And one of the things that they really value is we have a regular cadence with them, whether it's monthly, quarterly, it depends upon the project, the people, and all this other stuff. And different, we obviously have weekly cadences with the day-to-day people, but one of the things that we continue to see is that focus on having some sort of a cadence and a process where you're continually reviewing the history of what's going on, because whether it's an auditor, a CIO, a CISO, whoever it is, they want to see that history of compliance and security. There might be a dip at a point in time, but then it comes right back up, right? And so, for example, our platform automatically remediates from a compliance perspective. So if you forget to turn on encryption, if an application developer puts it on a Terraform, and within this Terraform, they forget to put on encryption, it'll automatically deploy encryption when it comes through on the cloud for us. And it'll show you that it did that. But that remaining in compliance is so important on those cadence, and showing, I mentioned the third-party tools, from a security perspective, going through and talking and showing the past quarter or past month of, hey, the vast majority of all this stuff was false positives. We have a cyber threat intelligence team. It's a contributory network because all of our 250 clients, it's all healthcare. We get to see a lot more. And then, but here's the three things that really mattered that happened in this past month. And here's how we dealt with them. And here's how we took care of them. And we called your team and got them involved on these two of them. And here's why, and here's what happened. And that continued compliance and being able to have that reporting, analysis, and then structured time is something that's just very valuable for our clients that they institute on their own, and then we help bring through for them, because they want to be able to see, to Sanjeev's point, that history, that continued knowledge that these things are going on. It's not just a point in time. Hey, we had this new acquisition and we had this brownfield environment that we wanted to bring on. It was already running from this acquisition, but we wanted to make sure that it's now up to our standards, because it may have been up to their standards, or maybe there were no standards. We're not exactly sure. But now that we're bringing it on, we want to make sure it's up to those standards. And so that continued working at it on a daily basis is really important. And then you have to have those check-ins to prove that that's going on, or else, anything you don't measure, you don't manage.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Good points. Good points. Michael, when we talk about these hundreds of vendors, is there, or what currently or in the future do you see as the role of automation to make these, continual reviews and making sure all these vendors are where they need to be from a security point of view, new vendors coming in? I'm sure a tremendous amount of this right now is done one-off, human beings dealing with this. Do you see the potential for automation to help here, or you see it being sort of human heavy for a long time to come?
I think human heavy for a while. I think there are tools vendors, and we see more of that, even how we manage our internal cloud instance. I still think it requires somebody who understands, automation isn't a silver bullet, right? You have to have a good, solid, repeatable process to then automate it, right? And I think where we see with a lot of these vendors, and I think back to some of the big ones in healthcare, some of the breaches, so on the vendor side, the past couple of years, I'm sure they had a lot of tools, a lot of automation. They still had ransomware, right? And those kind of things. So I think for us, it's blending that in to say, once we have a standard repeatable process, yes, let's automate it. Let's rely on some of those vendor third parties. You know, we not to, you know, our EDR platform, I think is very good. We've seen some of the vendors incorporate those automations into their native product, and we start to rely on those. And I think over time, as people get more comfortable, the human side of it, we don't have to double check as much. We trust it more. So I think it's that trust but verify. So when it gets to the point where it can, we have trust and confidence, then I think we start to back off the humans and start to focus on other areas. Where it gets dicey though is that SaaS piece of, you know, that of I don't know what the vendor is doing inside their environment. I don't know how they're managing. I don't know how they're applying automation. So I think in terms of what you manage, it's a good part of it. Then you're relying on that vendor to say, are they putting the same rigor around their automation capabilities?
Sanjeev, thoughts?
Yeah, I think you know, getting a little first, I love how Michael articulated you know, his viewpoint on this topic. I wanted to get a little more specific in terms of what would then be really helpful, you know, from achieving the cloud security topic that that we've been talking about. So let's take that a step further, right? So either it's our teams or it's service providers or partners, you know, the security by design that we all know about, it really has to be a critical element in ensuring that the process for SDLC that accomplishes, you know, the entirety of the goal from start to end in terms of going from development to production, really has to have full context of security in mind and in practice for doing that. But then how do you ensure that there's a consistency in the design itself in achieving the objective? So this ought to be a way of orchestrating cloud security policy that we would want as an organization in all our relationships across the board. And so to be able to do that requires, again, when I say thoughtful, I mean documented, understood policy, standards, and protocol that are then applied, tested against, and monitored for how you orchestrate that deployment through this SDLC process. And all of that said and done, you still have to focus on managing the attack surface, right? We have to have an efficient way of understanding how threats are impacting it. What are the changes that we would need to make based on understanding of the threats and exposures associated with evolving threat landscape, and managing vulnerabilities which come about on an ongoing basis, as you know, to stay on top of the architecture that we are expecting to be in this relationship and partnership co-managed scenario to be continuously resilient. And so you get to a state of certification, validation, attestation. Well, then the outcomes of those exercises would be consistent in terms of, oh, it was certified to be in a good state. Let's just use a good state as a acceptable state, 6 months ago, and taking all of the changes into account, we find the environment to be still in good state. That's really the way you get there in terms of, how do you really evolve over time, and how do you ensure that you have the state that you desire in terms of cloud security.
Andy, any thoughts on what Sanjeev just described?
Sanjeev is exactly correct. I love it. And it's exactly kind of the best practice that we see. It's a daily grind to continue to make sure that these things are done on a daily basis, but then it's that thoughtful approach to bring it all together and say, here's where we're going, because there are so many things changing. There's so many controls changing. There's so many new services within AWS every single month that you can go and use. They're making more of them, HIPAA eligible, right? But just because they're HIPAA eligible doesn't necessarily mean that they're HIPAA compliant out of the box. You have to know which switches to flip, right, in order to make it that way. So it's continuing to understand all of those things on a day-to-day basis. It's continuing to have the right, within your SIM and your SOAR, having the right type of data and analysis put in there from the EDR tools and all of the other tools that you have to ensure that you're now protecting against new threats. And going, and to Sanjeev's point, exactly, it's continue to have the thoughtful approach to build it right on the upfront, forward thinking, daily execution, and then at periodic times coming back and checking and making sure that those things are continued to be done and you're keeping up with the demand of the users, whether it's new vendors coming in or whether it's your application development team and developing new apps or data and analytics on your own. Those are the best practices that we see. Exactly.
Michael, I want to go in a little more detail. One of the dynamics that you touched on, and I hear about quite a bit from CISOs and CIOs. It's the dynamic of these very valuable, unique vendors. They're very valuable to the business. The business perhaps discovers them, one of the business lines, one of the departments, surgery, whatnot. And there's this vendor that does this amazing stuff, and they're great. Okay, we want them. Comes over to security, and you're like, it's a wonderful, there's no security here, or it's not sufficient, or this is not, and they say, but listen, this is unique, this will save lives, this is patient care. So you say, okay, essentially you wind up becoming the CISO for the organization. I think you touched on that dynamic, and I've heard that before. Especially, let's say we're talking about a cloud environment and we're talking about that dynamic. Number one, is that an accurate description of something that happens? And number two, how do you deal with that? You want to protect the enterprise, but you also want to empower the business with what they say they need.
Yeah, I would say it happens less. I would say in years past, it happened a lot more. I think part of it is education with senior leaders, business leaders, to understand, hey, my job, I do not make the decisions on risk for the organization. I will bring it up to the CEO who I report to and say, hey, this is high risk. If you want to accept it, it's well within but know what you're accepting, right? So for me, it's all about making sure that business leader, before they go with that accepting request, that they understand they're willing to go on, they're willing to put themselves out there and go to the CEO and say, yep, I recommend that we bypass our best practices and recommendations from our security team and adopt this new technology. It hasn't happened since I've been here. And so I think a lot of it's education. And when those new vendors come in that we're a little unsure of, is people say, hey, we're willing to work with you. We're not going to, of course, put PHI or any sensitive information. We're able to consult and provide information, feedback, our experiences, but we're just not going to let you move data and start to adopt technologies that we can't support. So that's been a maturation of the organization. And like I said, I'm thankful that it rarely happens when somebody comes out and says, hey, I know nobody supports this, but we think we need to do it.
But Michael, do you ever get to the point where it's sort of like, well, can you get them up to speed? And then you're acting like an outside consultant, and you're like, hey guys, you got a great tool, we'd love to use you, and here's what you need to do. And you almost wind up becoming this outside consultant.
We absolutely do that. And I look at that as that is a partnership approach, and I'd rather us pick vendors that are more mature, but sometimes they do have a good product, they're working on it, but they need feedback and advice on how to make it, how to make it compliant to our standards, but also to the industry. And so I think when those things happen, we usually try to set some guardrails and timelines. It's like, hey, we're not going to build out their whole entire security program, but here are the things that they need to get to. We'll point them in the direction, but I'm not going to have my team sit down with them and kind of design a security program. We just can't do that. But recently we had a vendor that, as we find pockets of ones that, basically they didn't know that they weren't HIPAA compliant. And I was like, how did you not know that? Like, that's something I shouldn't tell you, and I shouldn't have to tell you. So it's things like that where they still pop up, but that was one that had been in the environment for a while that we kind of found. And so, yeah, it's like I said, it's a cost of doing business, but you got to draw the line and say, we're only going to go this far. And at some point you got to back away.
Michael, you can just refer them to us.
Go refer them.
That's a great point. I was actually thinking about that. Andy. Absolutely.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. Sanjeev, have you seen this dynamic with these smaller vendors?
Absolutely have, and Michael articulated his response quite well. And the true nature of the vendors that come into play for any major health system will be of every flavor, right? Some are large, some are small, some are innovative and new, different degrees of security and compliance measures. But I think what we find is that we have a pretty robust assessment methodology. It produces a result, and the results are then guided with business context in terms of the value proposition, the level of risk associated, what corrective measures can the vendor or partner take to be able to fit into our architectural fit criteria that we have, right? So all of that is at play for sure. And yes, it's less in terms of somebody making a demand of a product that just doesn't fit the architectural context that we are operating in, and that doesn't happen very often. But what happens very often is where vendors really have a good product, they want to work with us, we want to work with them, but they just lack security and compliance measures that enable both of us to have a relationship. In that, we provide very honest feedback, and a lot of times vendors will go back and have a roadmap, and they work on that roadmap and come back and be successfully part of offering that we have in terms of partnership and relationships. Some just can't do that, and that's okay. Not everyone can go ahead and do that. But I think it's the partnership approach is extremely valuable. Innovation sometimes requires us to embrace new technologies that do come with risks that typically is not part of the scope of toleration per se, but then we can work with them to make sure they meet the basic as well as optimized requirements and needs that we have as an organization. And this is true for the industry. Just think about healthcare innovations that have taken place during just the COVID period and rapid adoptions. And that's not stopping, but rapid adoptions with innovation, with security and compliance is what we promote.
Very good. All right, I want to go to my favorite part, ask a co-panelist. Sanjeev, I want to give you the opportunity first to ask your co-panelist a question.
Well, this feels like an opportunity I can really go after. So to both Michael and Andy, I guess what types of approaches from a governance and architecture perspective that you have promoted or employed in your organizations to kind of serve this overall intent of having proper cloud security model for your organizations?
Michael, you want to go first?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sanjeev. We worked a lot on this and building it into our architectural review process that architecture and security kind of co-own. And I think when I first got here, there was the questionnaire, if it was a cloud vendor, is it a cloud vendor? And then it stopped. And so we've matured that to be, okay, the work doesn't stop there. So I think for us, it's really making sure security is at the table, co-partnering with architecture around the intake and the development, and making sure that we have people on the team who are knowledgeable about, and we don't have many of them. We're a mid-sized organization, but people that are knowledgeable about cloud security, because I think if you just ask general questions, you don't get to the root sometimes, and you can't ask the meaningful, thoughtful questions of the vendor. You just look at the SOC 2 and say, oh, good enough, right? So that's what we've tried to do, is incorporate it into that. Make sure that before we even start picking vendors, they have our requirements and what we're going to assess against, and so it's an open book test basically. So our job is, if you don't pass it, it's a, if you can't meet the requirements like we told you ahead of time, we told the business owner ahead of time before you go looking for vendors, if you pick one and it doesn't meet these requirements, then the answer is going to be, we don't recommend.
Andy?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And since this is all we do, and it's what we do, right, it's kind of core to us, is I would say that one of the main learnings that we've had is that the importance of security, compliance, and operations continuing to work together all times through this governance process and the architecture process. Because if you have silos, and where we find within our clients when they come to us and they're newer with us and things like that, we find when there's kind of misses, it tends to be because there's silos. It's not because they don't think about it, but because there's silos. And there's people who are thinking about it from a security perspective or a compliance perspective, or there's a different team that's thinking about compliance and one team's talking about operations. And if they're not working together and that governance process isn't working together, then that's where the kind of the two ships sailing in the nights happen, right? And that's one of the things that we work with our clients a lot on, and that we do internally, is to make sure that that is all done in unison and cohesively in order to have one architecture and governance plan as opposed to several.
All right, very good. I think no, I have to give Michael an opportunity. I want to hear what he wants to ask. Michael, come on. What
Yeah, no,
question do you
I
have
a
for your
question.
co-panelists?
And this is one we've been kind of struggling with, is this, and you kind of alluded there of this, how have you guys approached, or how have you seen people approach? Do you create a separate cloud security team, or do you break out the security discipline into on-prem and cloud, or do you really try to cross-train so you have a hybrid type of team? So that's one of the things we're kind of challenged with, of focus versus asking people to do a little bit of everything.
That's a great question. Sanjeev, you want to go first?
Well, I think the important, I love that question. An important part of that question is having the right skill sets, either that's in a single team, distributed team, but you ought to have a center of excellence that looks after the needs, and I'm going to say this in this way, needs of the cloud, right? And that needs are of different types, including security. And as much as you can, and I can have a center of excellence where right skill sets from infrastructure, networking, security, and applications are present, then a combined team of mindset, virtual or physical, can then accommodate for all of the concerns that Michael, you were alluding to in terms of addressing. And I think it depends on the size of the organization, number of associates you and I can have. We may have partners that we might bring to the table to complement, achieving the totality of the need that's on the table, right? So that's how we have approached it as a journey. I'm looking forward to hearing Andy's thoughts on how he looks after that topic.
Andy, what are you seeing out there with the clients?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's a great question because as someone who provides a service, what we tend to see is people approach it in a lot of different ways, but the capacity and the resourcing always ends up being the challenge, right? And it's how many cloud experts do you have? How many cloud security experts do you have? How much of this burden do you place on the developers versus the security team? All of those questions that are the complex parts of this. And that's why we tend to see our clients who come to us, we'll ramp up and do more for them at certain cycles of their development, and then ramp down and do less for them at other cycles because of that exact question. Because there's times when, if you're kind of steady state and you're kind of deployed and you have these resources, it's okay, and you kind of take some of that over. There's other times when you're really deploying a lot and you need more support and things like that. And so it's a kind of a balance that we see. And and sometimes those resources from your current teams want that ability to learn something new. And there's people who want to say, oh, I want to get into this cloud security, and they want to learn something new. And it's an opportunity for them to learn something new. And it's great to have that backing behind them so that they can learn how to do that, because in our industry, resourcing is just so scarce and it's so hard right now. And that's the biggest challenge that I see people coming with.
All right. Well, that was a great conversation. Unfortunately, we're about out of time. Regarding continuing education, you can use the final slide in this deck. You'll get an email when the on-demand recording is ready for viewing. If you want to sponsor an event with us, you can reach out to Nancy Wilcox from our team. You can go to our website to register for upcoming panels. With that, I want to thank our tremendous panel. Great conversation. Michael Carr, Sanjeev Shah, Andy Gilbert, ClearDATA for sponsoring, making the event possible, and you for attending. And with that, everybody have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.